All right, now on to part two of our lecture on the logical problem of evil. The first lecture we looked at kind of just two premises that the atheist says are inconsistent. Remember, G, that God exists and has, omnipotence, omniscience, and is morally perfect. And then E, there is also evil. And the atheist says that those two propositions are inconsistent. Well, before we can understand the actual problem, the argument against it, we have to understand what we mean by inconsistency. So we spent some time looking at logical inconsistency, and specifically we looked at contradictions and contraries, the two different ways two or more propositions can be inconsistent. Well, now that we've gotten the dry logical stuff out of the way, let's actually get to the meat of the problem. So the logical problem of evil alleges that there is a contradiction between G and E, which for review are: G is the proposition that there is an omnipotent, omniscient, and morally perfect God that exists, and E says that there is evil. Well, G and E are not contradictories. They can both be false. So if consistent, they are contraries. That both cannot be true. Once again, G and E are not contradictories. They can both be false. It could be the case that there is no God, but it could also be the case that there is no evil. So if these propositions in G and E are inconsistent, then they would have to be contraries. In other words, if one is true, then the other has to be false. So there's a lot of ifs in here. If G and E are inconsistent, then they are contraries. And if they are contraries, then if one is true, the other is false. They both cannot be true. Make sense? All right. Well, this could be fleshed out into an argument, and it'd be helpful to do so. So let's take a look at each property of God, God's omnipotence, omniscience, and his moral perfection, and see how that relates to E, the fact that there's evil. So if God exists and God is omnipotent, well, then there's no evil that God cannot prevent. If God exists and God is omniscient, then there is no evil that God does not know about. And if God exists and is morally perfect, then he would not permit any evil he knows about and can prevent. All right. Well, let's take a look at A first. If God exists and God is omnipotent, then there's no evil he cannot prevent. So Superman has a fair amount in common with God, just being super duper powerful. Only God is infinitely powerful, according to theists. God's also omniscient. He knows everything, like Magneto, only more. So God would be able to prevent any evils, and God would know about any evils that need to be prevented. And then, if God exists and he's morally perfect, then he wouldn't permit any evil he knows about and can prevent. In other words, God is not indifferent to our sufferings. God would not be the type of being that is indifferent to our sufferings. Well, from A through C, it follows that if there is an omnipotent, omniscient, and morally perfect God, then there will be no evil. Thus, we have the argument for why G and E are inconsistent. And recall the argument. If there is evil in the world, then God does not exist. Well, there is evil in the world, so God does not exist. And that's the argument that we have. Well, that's a problem for the theist. Well, how might the theist respond? Well, before we look at that, here's the argument for premise 1. If there is evil in the world, neither God permits it, in which case he is not morally perfect, or he does not know about it, in which case he is not omniscient, or he is powerless to prevent it, in which case he is not omnipotent. So if there is evil, then nothing has all the God-making attributes. Consequently, the being which the theist calls God must lack at least one of the God-making properties. It follows that the being one calls God cannot really be God. If nothing has all the God-making attributes, then nothing is truly God. So basically, if there's evil, if E, then we have to give up one of the main attributes of God. You have to give up, according to the atheist, God's omnipotence, God's omniscience, or God's moral perfection. But then that's the problem, because God is a being that has all three of those attributes. God is omnipotent, omniscient, and morally perfect. So any being that lacks at least one of those attributes couldn't even be God. Therefore, if there's evil, God doesn't exist. That's the argument. Pretty potent. It's omnipotent, not really. Well, can the theist respond to that? Yes. But how might the theist respond to that? Well, there's really just two ways. You can deny premise 1, or you can deny premise 2. Because the argument's valid. If the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. It's a modus ponens. If P then Q, P so Q. All right. Well, which premise should the theist argue against then? Well, recall, premise 1 says if there is evil in the world, then God does not exist. And premise 2 says there is evil in the world. Well, I don't think premise 2 can be denied. That's a really, I'd say you'd have to be deluded to deny premise 2. You'd have to be deluded to deny that there's evil in the world. These pictures only scrape the surface of the amount of evil in the world. So that's indisputable. There is bad stuff that happens. There's evil stuff that's happened. There's evil people. There's wickedness. There's horrendous injustices. So yeah, I mean, you'd be a fool if you're a theist and you tried to attack that premise. Okay. Well, what does that leave you then? You gotta deny premise 1, but how are you gonna do that? Given that we just saw this pretty potent argument. Well, in fact, the theist has 2 ways to argue against premise 1. Both ways are going to show that premise 1 is false, and the reason is because G and E are in fact logically consistent. So the theist is going to argue that that there's an omniscient, and morally perfect God, is logically consistent with E, there is evil. How might the theist do that? Well, recall the 3 premises used to derive a contradiction between G and E. A, if God exists and is omnipotent, then there is no evil he cannot prevent. B, if God exists and is omniscient, then there is no evil he does not know about. And C, if God exists and is morally perfect, then he would not permit any evil he knows about and can prevent. Okay. So basically, the theist has to show that at least one of those 3 things, A through C, is false. So which ones should they work on? In fact, the theist has reasons to show that at least 2 of them are false. All right. So all the theist needs to do is show that at least A through C does not in fact a necessary truth. The theist will first argue that C is not a necessary truth. So I'm not saying that it's false, I'm saying that it's not a necessary truth. Well, this is what is going to be, the first way is, we're going to consider is we're going to attack C. If God exists and is morally perfect, then he would not permit an evil he knows about and can't prevent. This is called a free will defense. And this is how it goes. A world where creatures have moral responsibility is better than a world where creatures have no moral responsibility. Okay? So, it's better to have a world full of creatures with free will than a world full of puppets or just robots. Okay? And I think we could all agree with that. Free will is something valuable if we have it. Okay? So if you're God and you want to create if you have to choose between 2 worlds, 1, a world with humans that don't have free will, and 2, a world where humans have free will, the better world is a world where humans have free will. Alright? Well then, if you were to create a world where creatures are morally responsible, you must create creatures with free will then. Because if an action's not up to you, you shouldn't be praised or blamed for doing it. If you don't freely do something, then you can't be held responsible for it. Okay? So a morally perfect being would want to create a world with moral responsibility, and therefore free will. Well, if a creature is going to have free will, then it's got to be possible for them to choose evil or good. Because if God caused creatures that always chose to do good, well then their actions wouldn't really be free or up to them. Okay? Therefore, God, in creating a world where creatures have free will, must permit some evil, if God is to create a world with moral responsibility and free will. Therefore, the existence of evil is consistent with the existence of God. And that's called the free will defense. If you want to have free will, so basically theism is consistent with evil because God has the power to create creatures with free will. But if a creature's going to have free will, they have to have the power to do good or bad. Alright, well it turns out then that C is not a necessary truth after all. God can be morally perfect, but create a world in which there is evil. Well, A is also not a necessary truth, the theist is going to argue. So A says that if God exists and is omnipotent, then there is no evil God cannot prevent. And the theist is going to say that A is not a necessary truth either. How are they going to do this? Well, sometimes evil is required for bringing about a greater good. And there are plenty of examples. We don't have to give any. For example, sometimes soldiers jump on grenades to save their fellow troops. Many of you have had surgery. Surgery hurts, but you get a greater good from the surgery. You get better health, right? So sometimes you have to permit some evil because it's going to lead to a greater good. Well, there could be cases where it is impossible to bring about some great good without permitting some evil to occur. For example, it's impossible for Jones to die courageously without Jones dying. It's logically impossible to die courageously without dying. So, there are some goods that can only be brought about by evils. There are some goods where it's logically impossible to bring them about without permitting some evils. Well, we don't even have to establish that this world does contain the greatest good if you're a theist. All you have to do as a theist is show that it's some great good is not logically possible without permitting some evil. That then would be another way to argue that G and E are in fact consistent. Even an omnipotent being cannot do what is logically impossible. For example, God couldn't will that 2 + 2 = 5, and God couldn't will that some great good that can only be brought about by some evil means be brought about without the evil, okay? So, it's in fact logically consistent. God's omnipotence is logically consistent with evil. Alright, case closed. Therefore, if it is logically impossible that some good exists without some lesser evil, then again, God can be omnipotent and still not be able to do away with evil. Alright, well, what are we going to do with that? Should the atheist just give up? Not so fast. The atheist has a response, and it's an important response that we should look at. So let's distinguish between justified evil and unjustified evil. We'll say that justified evil is evil that is logically necessary for some greater good or caused by free will. So justified evil would be, for example, the good caused by free creatures. God can permit that because it's good to have free creatures. Or it could be the types of evil necessary for some really great good. Unjustified evil is the evil that, is not brought about by free will or not brought about or is not necessary for some greater good. So that's how we'll define unjustified evil. It's evil that doesn't satisfy one or two. All right. Well, the atheist has a rejoinder to the atheist. The atheist will say that G is inconsistent with E star. There is improper or unjustified evil. So it's a slightly different proposition. It's not just that there's evil, but there's evil that's not brought about by free human wills or that doesn't lead to a greater good. And that is inconsistent with there being an omnipotent, omniscient, morally perfect being. For example, earthquakes aren't caused by human free will, and they probably don't bring about any greater good, according to the atheist. So the atheist would then say that not all evil is proper or justified, and that improper evil exists. And we don't have to rehearse various types of cases where that might be true. I think you get the point. Well, it seems correct that if an omnipotent, omniscient, and morally perfect God exists, then there would be no improper or unjustified evil. Further, that just seems like a necessary truth. Any evil that's going to be compatible with God has to be justified or proper. Therefore, G and F contradict E star. Alright, this leads to an argument. Premise 1, we'll call G star. If there is improper or unjustified evil, then God does not exist. E star says that there is improper or unjustified evil, so God does not exist. Well, again, if the theist is going to respond to this argument, they have to challenge G star or E star. Which are they going to challenge? Well, in this case, they're going to agree that G and E star are inconsistent. And they're not going to want to give up G or G star. So, what are they going to deny? They're going to deny E star. The theist is going to say, hey, atheist, there is no improper or unjustified evil. Well, how are they going to do that? Well, the atheist's reasoning above for E star would not convince the theist. And for two reasons. First, the appearance of unjustified evil to a less than omniscient mind does not entail the reality of unjustified evil. So appearances don't entail reality. Recall on the unit on perception, on knowledge, that we looked at, the difference between appearance and reality. Just because railroad tracks appear to us to converge doesn't mean that they converge. All right. In fact, they have to be parallel, or else trains wouldn't move anywhere. So the appearance of something doesn't tell the reality of something. So the appearance of unjustified evil to we feeble finite minds doesn't entail the reality of unjustified evil. Second, the theist is going to say that given that we're not omniscient, we should not be expected to understand the justification for all evil that occurs. Okay? We don't know everything. God, by definition, does know everything. So there may be some things that we don't understand. That doesn't entail that there's unjustified evil. That just entails that there's some evils that we don't understand why it's justified. So the theist will say. Okay, well, what's next? As you've seen, a significant part of the theist's response to the logical problem of evil is what we call the free will defense. But the success of the free will defense is going to depend in part on whether or not free will is coherent. Whether or not okay? So that's actually what we're going to look at next. We're going to see whether or not we have free will. That will be Unit 5, the final unit of this class.